Welcome everyone to the High Talks Wrong podcast. Welcome to the Fighting Anti-Intellectualism podcast. Today I'm joined by Greg, Nick. We're going to be talking about systemic racism, systematic racism. That's the same thing.
Systemic. We're gonna have to change that.
Systemic.
Because I mean,
Okay.
I've heard both words, systemic and systematic. If something is systematic, it's done in a systematized way. So that would mean that, like, if racism was systematic, that would mean that there was like targeted like quotas of we have to do this many racist actions per month. Whereas systemic means it's embedded in the system, that there are elements of our current institutions, government institutions, policing, that are where there's racism embedded in the actual fundamental structures of them.
The fabric of the thing, and
The
less
fabric.
yes.
The fabric of the things.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, we'll definitely try to fix that, or people will just kind of get it from what we talk
I'll
about.
just figure it out.
So where does
So,
everyone stand? Systematic racism or systemic racism? Where does
Systemic, yeah.
everyone stand on it?
I think I know where we stand. I think that Nick has evidence. I have a position. I think Nick shares the same position, except he actually knows the literature and the evidence to a degree because he
Okay.
worked in government. And then I think you, Autumn, might be skeptical because I think it's clear that certain legal structures and institutions were created or had racism baked into, they were created in a racist context or had racism baked into the legal structure. And I think you might be skeptical of that, Autumn. I don't know if you are.
Yeah.
Or?
Sorry,
Okay.
I spaced out for a little bit.
No, it's okay. I ramble. I'm not very coherent.
No, it's not that. It's my neurological connections in my head that cause that.
Sure.
Okay.
So I think a good place to start is I'll just say what I think is one or two examples of systemic racism that I think are real. Nick, maybe you have some historical context or some just some facts that to back it up, and then Autumn, if you object to any of it, we can pick it apart. So
Let's do it.
let's do it. Let's start with policing because that's probably the one that's most on the forefront of people's minds. So my opinion on this evolved as a result of listening to some Sam Harris interviews. He interviewed Larry Elder and I think one other person who
Larry Elder is a radio host who ran for governor in California, right?
Yes.
Did he? I didn't know that he ran for office.
Yes.
I just want to make sure I know who we're talking about.
So Larry Elder had kind of a fringe position. He basically said Larry Elder's black, and he said basically systemic racism is not a thing. It doesn't exist. And this came as, I was kind of shocked to hear somebody say this. This was in 2016, 2017 or something. So I was kind of shocked. And so, I thought I gave it some thought. But so one thing that also came out in a Sam Harris podcast was that one thing that's definitely clear in the evidence is that black people, especially black men, get rough physical treatment from police at a disproportionately higher rate. So if you get pulled over by a cop, the chance that you will be manhandled, put in a chokehold, treated with unnecessary roughness or brutality is higher if you're black. Do either of you guys know anything about that stat?
I do. I have some contention with it based off what was just said, but
yeah,
I want to keep hearing more.
So the two examples, I'm not very educated on this topic. I like to think about it. I've done a little bit of reading, but so the two examples that I feel at all confident talking about is that. So not police shootings, because I would like to look at the data on police shootings because I think that's a little muddier. But so police brutality and the results of redlining. Those are the two examples of systemic racism that I think I feel comfortable discussing a little bit. So redlining,
police brutality. I would also say the legal system. Apparently, statistically, blacks are more likely to incur a harsher sentence.
Harsher sentences, just okay. So that's good. So maybe those three we can look at for now. So I let's keep going with police brutality. So Nick or Autumn, do you have any thoughts on that? The higher proportion of people getting treated with unnecessary roughness by police.
Yes. What is the context of each individual situation? Because that matters. For example, George Floyd wasn't just put in a chokehold or put a knee. Oh, thank you. Didn't have a knee on his neck just because he was black. I think there's led a lot of things, a lot of factors led to that situation. I actually do believe by the notion that when you have the black community being the way they are, like they're not as individualistic as the white community, if you were to say that. They're more like
I don't know about all that.
being in Japan, they're more community based. They're more with
Yeah.
each other than they
Yeah.
are individualistic, which is perfectly fine. In fact, I think that kind of system works a lot better than individualistic at times.
Collectivism.
Yeah. But for example, you have the quote unquote talk, which I think puts a lot of fear into black men's minds about what the
Okay.
police will or may not do to them.
Mhm.
Because of that, it creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, and people's tones start to rise up, and that escalates situations, I think.
So you would argue that the fear of police brutality leads to people who are black.
It's more complicated than that.
So just okay, but I guess more complicated. I'm saying that might lead to people acting in a more
aggressive nature,
aggressive or excited manner around police officers, which would make their life more dangerous. That would make
I don't. That's a very useful statistic, but it doesn't, like most statistics, it doesn't actually tell you the reason why. I don't think that any statistic actually can be proven to show that black people are manhandled more just because they're black.
So,
talk to me, Nick.
I was just saying, well, at least when I was thinking of that, there are significant sentence. When I was looking at things like with systemic racism, in terms of things like sentencing disparities, there's been a lot of some disparities around issues like deferred prosecution agreements, and the real problem here is that where the police are located makes it confusing because people are being arrested, but where the police more likely to be and where they're making more aggressive arrests tends to be in black neighborhoods. So one of the confusing things about these statistics is that, there is some disparities, but it's also a matter of geography almost. So I would say systemic racism, a lot of the arguments for systemic racism, at least I've heard, there's disparities. They tend to be more based upon history and inability of people to, for example, get qualified for government programs. These arguments are much less squishy, like around the GI Bill. That's where they argue was, so like a lot of police shootings, there's gaps and the argument and a lot of theories. Well, the only reason that's happening is because of racism, and that's great, but that's a hard argument to like prove. People are going to argue over it. The better arguments are things like the GI Bill, which excluded Black Americans, and that led to Black American veterans having less wealth, and that led to them not being able to qualify for things like home loans, which also led to them not being able to move out to suburbs or acquire more intergenerational wealth. So they're better, more concrete arguments. I think a lot of the problems with the police things is that policing strategies are different all over America. And you have different communities, and communities have different crime rates, and that's where police are sent. And the police, on average, may treat Black people worse. But it's very hard to nail down in an individual case if that was precisely the motive, which makes it a very confusing topic for most people. And you see a lot of people say, well, I knew that person, that wouldn't have happened if it was a white person, or that wouldn't have happened if it was an X person. But it's hard to, it's really hard to, and that's what spawned a lot of protests and bitter arguments in America, right? Perceived double standards. But that's really hard to get into, and that's where people get into the weeds a lot, which is not that great. I mean, I've seen, the police being to spend more time in Black communities making drug arrests, but how much is, and because of broken windows theory, they spend a lot of time in those communities. There's a higher homicide rate, so the police spend a lot of time. Is that systemic racism that the police are in those communities making a lot of arrests. Does that constitute systemic racism? Some people would argue yes, it does. Some people would argue no, it doesn't, because some people would argue they're over policed. This is, we're trying to. In Ferguson, we saw what one could argue was systemic racism, which is where police were giving out lots of tickets to these poor communities, and they were being turned into an income source basically for the city. That was a better. Again, this is a better argument that if you're poor and if you're black, you're getting a lot of you in some of these communities, you're getting a lot of tickets, and that's generating revenue, and they don't have a lot of voice, so they can't really do much about it. And that was a better argument for systemic racism than individual.
Why don't they have a lot of voice? You get a ticket. If it's bullshit, challenge it. Well, everyone has the equal amount of voice in the court of law when you're contesting a ticket.
I mean, technically, but if you have a lot of things related to the legal system, the deck sometimes is stacked against you. When you have for example, if you have a criminal record and you show up in court, they're less likely to necessarily take you seriously than if you don't have a criminal record, for example. So it's a little stacked against the deck's a little stacked against anyone who might have a ticket or have been convicted of a crime.
But that's not racism. And you look at the details of the cause, you find out it's not really racism. It's other factors. Oh, we don't believe you because you have a criminal record. That's a bullshit thing, but it's not racism.
Well, that's why it's called systemic racism, because it's not entirely. You can't just automatically say it's right. You could say the city council thought that black people would be more likely to would be easier to ticket, so they sent police to target black communities. And that's why so the argument is the city council, that was a racist plan by the city council, right? That seems to be the that would be the assumption in somewhere like Ferguson in 2014. And that might constitute systemic racism, I guess. But of course, people would have to, there's no, I don't know if there's been anyone who's actually shown the city council plan for that to happen. There's been allegations, but like a lot of other issues, these become very squishy without evidence.
Let's take the least squishy examples, because it will be, even though the least squishy examples are going to be the easiest to talk about, and I think we'll be able to blast through them fairly quickly. And then after that, we should talk about some of the more squishy issues like police brutality, and then what you were just talking about with having a criminal record, making it less likely for you to have your hearing in court. Stuff like that. So, but let's start with the least squishy issues. So the GI Bill. Nick, tell me about racial disparities as a result of the GI Bill.
So most Americans went to school with the GI Bill, right? Many Americans who served in the war, a humongous number were
World War II.
In World War II, there was a labor force. GIs, thousands of Americans served in World War II. White, black, Asian, Hispanic. They all served in the World War II. They came home, and Congress was afraid that those people would get into the workforce without skilled, and the economy would collapse, and there'd be a massive number of people entering the workforce. It'd be a real problem. So to deal with this, and as sort of a payback for doing all this hard work in World War II, and to bring larger wealth to America, to try to uplift the population, Congress passed the GI Bill, which allowed people who had served in Americans who served in World War II to get benefits, which would allow them to go to school basically for free, or get some equivalent amount of money. I forget how it was. It was a little complicated, but the point is they got the means to go to school, which then for free, which tons of them took advantage of. Right. That laid the basis for a lot of the prosperity in the 50s, 60s, 70s that we saw. Was a large amount of new educated workforce showing up and basically building a new professional class in America that came out of the GI Bill. Now, of those people, African Americans were ineligible for GI program benefits. So, and they did serve in World War II, and sometimes in combat capacity, many times in rear service area personnel, but in combat capacity in various campaigns, like in Italy. So, that and that was an enormous wealth driver and create a new middle class for white people. And for other people, I don't know how. I do know that black people are not eligible. I'm not sure about the other groups, but the argument is that they're still owed those GI benefits, and that led to basically that also led to the redlining you're talking about to some extent, because you argued the redlining last time was that people didn't have any income, any money to show the bank to get a house, right? That was one of the things we talked about with they didn't have any collateral to help buy a house. Well, if you don't have a degree and you didn't earn a bunch of money with the GI Bill, you might have a hard time getting collateral to then start a house. So
this might be a good starting point for this whole conversation, because do you agree, Autumn, that since an entire ethnic group, black people, were excluded from the GI Bill, and therefore since they weren't able to build the same kind of generational wealth that white Americans were as a result of the GI Bill, that is a racist policy that it's baked into the system? So it's systemic racism. Do you agree with that?
Right now, no.
Okay. What about that is not systemic?
Back then, when after World War II, yeah, that definitely seems pretty racist. But right now, there's nothing stopping a black person from really achieving their dreams in this country.
Well, that's not my point. My point is that since they were excluded from the GI Bill, they were prevented from starting to build generational wealth, and it was a big.
I don't believe in generational wealth. I think that the wealth you have is simply the wealth that you get. Because you can be born, let's say Donald Trump, he was born into a wealthy family, wasn't he?
Yeah. That's generational wealth.
So people can get inherent wealth, but that does not mean they know how to keep it. So
what are you talking about? If you're born into wealth, you're more likely to be wealthy in your life. That is incontrovertible.
But you're not.
Yeah, but that's caused by probable other factors, not necessarily just because you have the wealth. Just because you have wealth does not mean you know how to keep it. It's like people saying, I was arguing with someone recently about this. They said that I don't respect billionaires because, it doesn't take much to keep connections. I'm like, no, to keep connections and networking does take some skill to maintain those relationships. It's not something that's just like any idiot can inherit wealth and remain wealthy. Eventually, you're going to need some skills. Probably their parents taught them some skills to keep that wealth. Most of the time, people don't always keep that wealth. We see people who win money from the lottery and then they spend it completely. They don't save it. They don't invest in it.
I'll be honest. I'm surprised. I'm surprised you're going here on them. It's so self-evident that if you're born wealthy, you're more likely to stay wealthy.
So I mean, it's complicated because we're going.
I would need some citation from that.
All right, sure.
Would prove that conclusively.
Yeah, I'll try to look them up
if you can.
What were we saying, Nick?
I said I think that it's confusing because we get into the systemic racism of communities and how they build up, when a lot of this stuff was shaped by events that occurred in the past, some of it which were and the people who argue for systemic racism argue that it was designed, imprinted in the fabric, and people were just planning this out there are some counter arguments for this, especially during the 60s when people tried to bring black workers into the booms of the civil rights era. There was, for example,
into the booms?
Into the economic.
Oh, I see.
So there were attempts to bring black workers into the boom. And much of the Great Migration was where black workers moved to the north to get jobs in factories and such. So there were some means to possibly build some of that wealth still in spite of the GI Bill. Obviously, since they didn't have access to GI Bill, it wouldn't translate the same way. It didn't, but I think that there's a lot of historical confusion around these, and we have cited a number of examples. Black Wall Street, in Tulsa, that when black people succeeded, the white supremacist establishment would come attack them, kill them, destroy their businesses, destroy their wealth. That has become a resounding belief, right? And that this country was founded on white supremacy, and that the white supremacist orgs spend a lot of time suppressing black communities for their benefit, I guess.
Well, so that would be a result of individual racism, like individual racists, actively suppressing black wealth, and we can talk about that and the degree to which that's systemic. We
But
can also talk about.
that's put into systemic rate. That is seen. The systemic racism and the confusion around it is because people have lumped a lot of these things together. They've lumped people who are
Gotcha, I
racist
see
in the
what you're saying.
KKK. We've lumped government policies that have screwed over specific groups. That's just a symptom of it. But then we've also lumped individually racist incidents into that. So that's why there's a lot of confusion over these terms and why these terms struggle. So one of the reasons they struggle, not to mention the fact that there's some conflicting evidence, but the fact that people have kind of put them all together into one big mesh of America, white supremacist
White
state
supremacy,
compounding,
yeah.
and that's baked into America, and we need to work as best as we can to dismantle it. So that's all been kind of baked into this that's become into this larger narrative, and that's put all these different things together. But there was an organization called the Ku Klux Klan. It did regularly lynch black people. It was absolutely horrendous, right?
Still around.
So yes, well, it's still around. I don't know how many lynchings. There have been like one or two selected lynchings, I think.
Lynchings almost never, but the KKK is still around. That's all.
Yeah, the KKK still exists. Like, they've been rebranded 50 million times. So the argument is that white supremacy evolves, and it's KKK also went through multiple iterations in the 1920s, in the 1960s, in the 1950s. It's evolved in the 1870s. So the argument is that white supremacy sort of evolved around then, and then after the KKK, it kind of got taken over by the war on drugs and the suppression of the Black Power movement, which did somewhat occur. But the Black Power movement was also, like many other revolutionary movements, sort of sometimes in struggles with the government. So that obviously, again, there's a lot of muddying of the waters.
Sure. We don't want to. Oh, sorry. So if you're going to finish your point.
But obviously, there are actual policies that were racist that cause systemic problems, and I think it's best to focus on those. And we can see what might be done to fix those policies. For example, giving black vets who are still alive access to those GI benefits. There's still World War II black vets alive, right?
Right, but we still have not. We still have not established whether generational wealth is a thing, and so that's a major sticking point. Because if we don't establish generational wealth as a thing, then it's going to be very difficult to establish that there are any systemic policies that are racist that are baked into the system.
I don't think so. I think it can be exclusive. Racism. But as for the World War II veterans, I highly doubt there's any, if many.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of them are past 100 years old. Like, a lot of people don't live that long.
So it's very clear that at this point in 2022 that there is a narrative built around systemic racism. I have heard a person accused of being systemically racist. It's like, oh no, you're not racist, you're systemically racist. I think that's an idiotic statement. A person cannot be systemically racist. White silence is violence, I think, is a stupid phrase. The fact that the idea that if you're not marching with Black Lives Matter, then you are racist, or that you are upholding white supremacy, or you are an apologist for white supremacy, I think that's stupid. I think these are all bad. I think there's been a very inaccurate, not fact-based narrative built around white supremacy and systemic racism. I think all three of us acknowledge that narrative exists, and there's not that much else to say about it because it's sort of bound up in like intersectional ideology and critical race theory and all that. And
it definitely is out there, and there's definitely some validity to how people, when people see things, they see, for example, in some of these police videos, they see someone's nervousness. They see a police officer's nervousness. They see a police officer emptying the whole clip. And so, or they see a picture of, the police seeing a black and white guy fight, and they tackle the black guy. So that's where they find systemic racism. People calling the police, or someone calling the police on a black family for whatever reason, or the police person, or the black couple being stopped disproportionately, and the people being afraid of a black family and calling the police on them. So those are more of the things which lead to the narrative today than the more obvious
Yeah.
concrete examples we can find.
Yes,
But
and they're worth talking about. So bias in policing, you have racial bias in policing. That is something to talk about, but I feel like we should talk about it after we establish whether or not we think, as you know, whether the three of us agree that there are policies that are baked in the system that are racist. Because those are the squishier issues, right? Like racial disparities in policing, those are squishier. Let's focus on the least squishy issues right now. So being excluded from the GI Bill prevented Black families from building generational wealth. I view this as an example of systemic racism. Autumn is questioning whether generational wealth is even a thing. So she pulled up this Yahoo article. Do you want to have you read through it, Autumn? Do you want to summarize what you're taking away from it?
Yeah, 1 second.
Okay.
I got I have to use Francis's tab to do this live stream, and I have like the FBI statistics on my own Chrome window, so I'm having to switch back and forth.
Yeah, I'm just using my phone.
Unfortunately, my other third monitor doesn't want to work with me.
That's all right.
I think it's a bad HDMI cord, honestly. But I can read the whole thing if you want me to.
No. I don't want you to do that. But just what your takeaway is. So it's 5 lies about systemic racism. I haven't read that much Yahoo News.
Yeah,
so
I wouldn't say lies. That's kind of a weird way to title it. Honestly, I would say 5 misconceptions about generational wealth. That would have been a lot better. But who am I to say? It's not like I'm a journalist or anything.
No, they're going for shock value, or they're going
it's called yellow journalism. I got in a big argument with Francis about it in the car. We were talking about it, and anyways, generational wealth lasts forever. Smart investors and money managers' skills are not always passed down with wealth. A staggering 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the next generation. 90% losing it in the generation after that. Sustaining substantial wealth takes financial savvy, something that not all rich parents pass along to their heirs. Mm-hmm. Heirs are always brought into the family business. Not true. That's no real evidence for that.
Yeah, let's just go. Just point by point.
Come from generational wealth. Every person makes their money from that. Wealth is recession proof. Obviously, that's not true. Mm-hmm. Family businesses have staying power. I don't know who ever said that. So I thought this would be an interesting argument because I think it's not that you're completely wrong in my eyes. It's more like there are some nitpicky things I disagree with, the common conceptions about generational wealth. People usually use it as blacks don't have any generational wealth, so systemic racism. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Now, if you're talking about the GI Bill, that's definitely something that's fucked up. But it also comes from a very racist era.
So the results of that. So it's wealth is not the best indicator, or wealth is not the best indicator. It's not the only indicator of inequalities as a result of something like the racist exclusion of Black people in the GI Bill. So so that generation got to go to school. They got to accumulate wealth. That helped them to buy homes in neighborhoods with good schools, send their kids to better schools. So even if 2 or 3 generations down the line, the wealth accumulated as a result of the GI Bill is squandered by the grandchildren of these white families, there are other advantages: better healthcare, better education, growing up in a better neighborhood that's less crime-ridden, that carry over from generation to generation, even if the wealth does not. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, but then I have to ask, you're talking about living in areas with higher crime. Why do these poor areas have higher crime though?
Let's assume.
I would say that could be because of poverty, but I've seen statistics saying it is, and some saying it's kind of iffy, and I think it's an area we don't really understand yet. But back then during what?
Oh, sorry, keep going.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, before you cut in, sorry.
Oh, I'm saying there's a lot of stuff that is poverty and crime interlinked, but at the same time, there have been examples of relatively impoverished or not wealthy neighborhoods, which are not which do not necessarily have a high crime rate. But there is a strong link in the research, from my understanding, between poverty and crime.
Yeah, yes, there is a link. I don't know how strong it is because I've seen several things kind of making it kind of muddy.
Well, we can get into that because that will then come back around to the conversation about policing and like why police are focusing more on black neighborhoods, etc. But let's stay focused on wealth for the moment and sort of the cascade, like the results of the exclusion of the GI Bill. So it is pretty clear that if you're able to make money for yourself, your kids will get better food, better health care, grown up safer, better neighborhood. They'll have more of an opportunity to either go to school or go to trade school or something like that. So do you agree with that, Autumn?
Yes, that's usually how capitalist society will work.
Yeah, well, it's even any society. Like if there's wealth in the family, I mean, I guess it wouldn't work in communism because communism
really
doesn't
only
allow for.
The reason why I say capitalism is because in order to have like a poor, impoverished group of people and maybe a middle class, and to have like like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, that it's not that's caused by capitalism.
Yeah, I mean,
For the most
okay. I
part.
mean, like there are other. I mean, there are systems that existed before capitalism where like wealth was accumulated. But yeah. In order to have like a middle class like this,
If you're talking about the Middle Ages, that was more in blood rather than anything else. It's just because people had the land, they could keep controlling people, but it wasn't really a capitalist society. It was a very slanted society. You had to work. You made like a little bit of gold. And if you're lucky, and the thing is, not a lot of people thought about investing into their own land because it's just something that doesn't occur to everyone.
What? Well,
people get kind of complacent in the system that they're in.
You're talking about in feudalism because they didn't own the land, so they couldn't invest in it. That was one of the reasons why.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to invest in your own land because in feudalism you didn't actually own the land. You rented it from a lord, and you had to pay your lord.
Right. Well, where did the lord get the land, Nick?
We're very far afield right now.
When did the Lord get the land?
No, how did the Lord get the land?
He was given a title by the king frequently.
And where did the king get the land? Like there is some wealth tied to this.
Okay,
it wasn't just hey, you get this land. It was more than just that.
Let's try to get back on topic.
Yeah. I don't think generational gap, as it's being purported, is valid as an argument. I think that there's just a lot of factors that have to be considered when you're talking about systemic or systematic racism, whichever one it is. Which one is it?
Systemic or institutional?
I'll just say institutional. That probably is easier for me to remember.
The number one arguments I've heard for systemic racism have been related to things like the Capitol insurrection or police disproportionate response. Yeah, someone said that since it was mostly white people, the police didn't do very much. That if the same crowd had been black, they would have the police, the armed forces.
That's just idiocracy.
So you think that's credible?
Antifa destroyed fucking Portland, and guess what? They're mostly white. They're mostly white people who are protesting in the Black Lives and Antifa protests in Portland, and the police didn't give any fucks.
So that's at least those.
So that's thrown out the window.
Okay.
And anecdotes are not going to be the most helpful here.
Well, that's what shows up on social media. So
this is not anecdotal. I'm speaking more as like the same way any journalist would. Everything a journalist sees can be written down as fact. And I do work as one. I've studied this. I've reported on this. And it's all over the news. You can find it just by a simple Google search.
Well, I would say
Google search.
I just to be clear about what I mean by anecdotal, Antifa's behavior in Portland and the police response in Portland, that is an anecdote. Like that is one example.
It's really not. There's plenty of videos showing that. There's this one video I saw. You may
do not understand what anecdotal evidence is. That anecdotal evidence is rather than like a meta-analysis of no, it's not just personal experience. It's like an instance. So the Antifa riots in Portland after George Floyd, that is an instance. That is an anecdote. The police response, it's anecdotal. It's as opposed to like like an overall look at statistics. That's the difference between like statistical evidence and anecdotal evidence. I'm not saying that you're just making things up. That's not what anecdotal means.
I mean, I would say
amusing or interesting story about a real incident or person.
I think one of the best arguments for systemic racism was done long between CRT. It was done long between any of these other studies came out, which was just the fact that if you're, I think if they did a study and found out if you had a white if you were a white person with like a felony on your record, you were more likely to be given a job interview than a black person without a felony. Something like that. There was just enormous disparity in name, who was getting called back based on names. I forget it. Don't really do not quote me, but there was
Yeah, I know. I know what you're talking about.
There
When
was that was the best argument for
who wrote
systemic
White
racism.
Fragility?
That was an
Robert DiAngelo.
actual
Robert
study.
DiAngelo. She went to my college at Clackamas Community College and spoke to all the teachers about how racist they were, basically. And one of her evidence was actually just that. People with black sounding names were less likely to be hired than someone with a white sounding name for the same qualifications. Thing is, no one has the exact same qualifications. Generally, there's different kind of variables that go into each person because everyone's individualistic. And I don't think that doesn't really prove that they were denied because they have a black sounding name. That's just happenstance at this point. We'd have to dig further into researching why that was the case.
Yeah,
One of
let's
the
do
problems
that.
with critical race theory is that since it goes off the assumption that if there's a gap, it is probably likely because of racism.
That's because everything has to be race related. Will Smith slapped someone and everyone lost their shit. Must be because he's black, or it's because they have to appear white in order to not offend white people. And it's like race is not that common. Most people do not give a shit about race. They don't.
We've already established that there is a race ideology in intersectionality and critical race theory that views systemic racism, or that views white supremacy is ever present, systemic racism is ever present. We've acknowledged that. That's just going to muddy the waters here. So let's talk about hiring practices. So do African Americans face discrimination based on their identity? So if all things are equal, let's say someone has a high school GED and they've done odd jobs and they have a felony. You have a white person, a black person. Those are pretty similar qualifications. When you say they've worked at a gas station, they've worked at a convenience store, and they have a felony, and they have a high school diploma or GED. Those are pretty much the same qualifications. Wouldn't you agree, Autumn?
Okay, but if you're going to be doing like real qualification comparison between a black person and a white person that have the same qualifications, your pool is going to be extremely low because most people won't actually have the same qualifications applying to the same job. It's very similar to the wage gap, saying that for the same skills, the same background, a woman gets paid less. But you look at this, if you look deeper into it, you find out that's not actually true.
Well, let's look deeper.
There's a lot more to it than just you're a woman and I'm paying you less.
Well, let's look deeper into it because there may be. So I'm looking at AmericanProgress.org right now. It's arguing.
Yeah, I'm looking at something too. Oh
okay.
My God, my neighbors.
So let me look at this citation. All right. Labor market segmentation theory, well established in sociology. Let me look at this article that the
study in question is about measures callbacks for interviews, not applicants getting the job.
Okay. Callbacks is good. A good place to look at, though.
Yeah, it is. I don't think it really makes much difference, honestly, but it is a caveat.
Yeah. Well, let's just look at callbacks if there is in fact if there is a persistent pattern of white applicants getting callbacks more often than the black equivalents with pretty much the same qualifications, would you agree that is systemic racism?
Say that one more time. I was reading.
Okay, it's okay. If you have if you have a persistent pattern of black people and white people with the same qualifications getting black people getting less callbacks, would you say that's systemic racism?
Not directly. I would have to inquire further why they're doing it and their intentions, but I can see why it would lead to that. It's more likely to be that case than it was prior.
What I'm detecting from you, Autumn, is you have a dislike of the term systemic racism because of the way it gets thrown around nowadays.
Not really.
No? Okay.
I'm very indifferent to it.
Okay. Good. Glad to hear that.
I think that this again gets kind of stuck in the weeds because there's geographical differences in communities. There's people see racism and they put it on social media very frequently, or things they perceive as racist, and that is very common. Is when people people say, someone says, I applied for this job and I was put in a black name and then I didn't get it. Then I applied with a white name and I did get it. So people put up these things, and these again are not scientific things, but this fuels that belief system. Well,
I'm looking at this article on T and F online. I don't know what this is. Maybe it's not credible.
Oh my goodness.
It's a sociological article. Labor market segmentation: the effects of race, gender, and structural location on earnings. All I can see is the abstract so far.
Here, I'll send you this one. I don't know if it's worth anything, but I'll send you this one just in case it might be of use for you.
Okay.
Since
Sending
I
it
won't.
to the to our group chat or to.
I sent to you in Messenger.
Okay. Employees replies to racial names.
One of the weaknesses say is that it simply measures callbacks for interviews, not whether applicants get the job and what the wage for a successful applicant would be. So the results cannot be translated into hiring rates or earnings. Another problem with the study is that the newspaper ads represent only one channel for job search.
Oh, newspaper ads? Yeah, that's not even like a common channel these days.
What's a newspaper, Craig? I don't even know what that is.
Yeah, I don't know.
People
Is that like an online source of information?
I think it's something that you use to wipe your butt with when you're out of toilet paper.
No. I think we're talking about is the thing you use for dogs to pee on.
Nice.
Something that was used by society thousands of years ago.
Thousands, yeah.
Well, not
Some
thousands. It started
probably
in
around,
ancient Rome.
Probably
ancient
thousands.
Rome. Thousands.
That's a ways. It's a ways
It's
back.
a couple thousand.
They didn't have they used the stones for that. They used like a stone.
They didn't just use stones. They'd have someone go up on the platform and they would declare everything.
Then the guy from the Rome.
Oh yeah, the Rome from Rome. I can't remember that actor's name though. I've seen him in several stuff.
But
he's a funny guy.
I was gonna say that the evidence for these are really I think the idea of systemic racism stems from both the reaction to actual racism, like some of the things that are systemic that people claim are systemically racist, it's just normal racism.
So when I see this right here, names discrimination study finds Lakeisha, am I saying this right? Lakeisha and Jamal still less likely to get hired than Emily and Greg. Wow, Greg, your name's right up there.
I got hired. What can I say?
Yeah. There's a few things that come to my head just from reading this alone is why, how much of a difference, because you're never going to have the same hiring rates for everyone across the spectrum. It's going to vary. And the other thing is, I think what's probably going through these employers' head is Lakeisha, probably black, but that's not really a deciding factor. I think it's more like they probably are viewing racial stereotypes, like, oh, they probably are lazy. They probably have an attitude or something.
So that would be individual racism, not systemic.
It's not necessarily because of the race. I think it's more like a profiling of sort. It's like it's using.
Wasn't that racism?
That's racist. Yeah,
isn't that racism?
Yeah, if they're relying on racial stereotypes to determine who they're hiring and who they're not hiring, that's racist. But that's not systemic racism.
This kind of feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy where people have stereotypes and then they act on them, even if they're not necessarily racist. They might still act on stereotypes that they know about because of racism.
Stereotypes exist for a reason.
Why do they exist?
Because they exist because people exhibit them in commonalities. An example, what's a good example? People talk about like gender stereotypes. Like you hear like gender critical people talking about gender stereotypes, like it's gross. But you'll see the person is a male, short hair, wearing male clothes. Those are all stereotypes of a man.
Right. I mean, that's one example. Like, so I'm Jewish. There's a stereotype that Jews are good with money or they're miserly, and that is based in reality to a degree because my grandma was Depression era. New York City garment working family. Because of the Great Depression, they became incredibly frugal, very, very tight with their money. And then, there's a long history of Jews being involved in like money lending and like the diamond business, stuff like that. So like, Jews, like we have accumulated some money savvy over the generations. So that stereotype is based in reality. I agree. If you're letting stereotypes influence your hiring decisions and the way that you treat people, I mean, especially if they're racial stereotypes, if you say to yourself, I don't want to hire, this person sounds black, their name sounds black, I don't want to hire them because if they're black, then they might be lazy or aggressive or whatever. That's racist. I think that's racist.
The other thing to think about is probably nowadays people will go other way not to hire someone who's a minority just in spite the fucking affirmative action, because that's a lot of rich people tend to be a bit more conservative, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
and at least conservative with their money.
So you're
And
saying, okay?
what?
Yeah.
No, sorry, keep
The-
going. I missed. Keep going.
Yeah, I know where you're going with that. I mean, that may be true. If that's the case, still think if they're not hiring on the basis of rate, like, yeah, if it's like a fuck you to like the whatever to like affirmative action or critical race theory, like maybe that's not necessarily racist, but like I don't know how common that is. That's just speculation. Can we confirm, like, yeah, maybe doing independent research on our own time would be the best way to prepare for something like this, but like I feel like we could confirm whether there is a hiring disparity right now.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at pnas.org. Meta-analysis of field experiments shows no change in racial discrimination in hiring over time. Basically, that African Americans are still discriminated against. They don't get callback. They get callbacks at lower rates, just based on controlling for other variables. They still get callbacks at lower rates, even to this day.
We'd have to find out why these are happening, and I don't think that's really possible, at least for us three.
Probably not during this time. Yeah, I mean, we can move on to something else. Basically, like, it's pretty clear to me that like history of racism and racial stereotypes accounts for some of the hiring disparities. People think that like black people aren't going to work as hard or whatever.
It could be. We don't know.
No, we don't know. I guess I don't know.
The problem is it's such a squishy term, systemic racism, because it's everywhere and everything. So
it's loosely defined.
It's loosely defined.
We are defining it more precise, or I am defining it more precisely. Systemic racism is. I am. I don't like the overly general, overly sort of like mystical and pervasive definition that you get in like, you know, the interest in like intersectional circles. Systemic racism is racism, racist policies baked into the system, redlining, the GI Bill disparity. That's like it's a pretty specific term that the way I'm using it. But so all right, so maybe we can't confirm right now that the source of or whether hiring disparities are still happening, or maybe we can agree that hiring disparities are still happening. But then the question is, why are they happening? Is there a valid reason that isn't racism? Because Nick, you were pointing to hiring disparities as the least squishy example of systemic racism, and now we're finding it's actually kind of squishy.
Well,
so use your big brain and get a less squishy example for me, please.
Yeah, do your job, Nick.
Do your job, Nick. You're supposed to be the smart one.
I said that was well, that's probably the thing that people read about the most in terms of and led them to think systemic racism existed in terms of the evidence was when I read about that, and when people think about it and then think about if I was this skin color I probably wouldn't get hired. And that's what leads to the belief in systemic racism, I was going to say. And those studies in the media where people don't necessarily look at, say, I mean, there is still a gap. People see a gap and people assume some percentage of it is racism because people do things because there are racist people in our society, right? The majority of most hiring managers are probably white, right? So it is a reasonable assumption that there's at least some degree of racism in those practices. Among white people. So
why? Because they're white?
Because there is some percentage of the white population is racist.
That goes for everything, though. Every race is racist. Black people are racist. Asians are racist.
Well, that's why I brought the GI Bill, because that wasn't so difficult. I brought the GI Bill because that was a lot easier, because you were asking for a very concrete example. I said this was the best example. This is still the best example of there's a massive gap between getting callbacks. And yeah, getting callbacks does equate to likely more getting a job, being able to prosper, being able to function well. And I was bringing up if you look at, I think a better example is the fact that more is the rate of criminal convictions and the criminal record in people in more in impoverished Black communities. And that make it harder to get a job. That was my argument. A better argument for systemic racism than just the disparity is that when you have a criminal record or some, when there's police are more heavily policing brown and Black communities, and they're a higher police presence in those communities for various reasons, all the various reasons why police normally policing those communities. Anyways, so people, they tend to, because the broken windows theory of policing, they tend to give out more tickets, and people end up with criminal records, and that tends to lead to not being able to get a job, or having more trouble getting a job, or being convicted of a felony, or, and those things can have, lead to problems with jobs. So that's what I would make an argument for institutional racism in America, is those, again, like the Ferguson practice, but I mean, I can't prove a conspiracy, but I would just say that's a better argument for,
regarding the Ferguson thing, about, let's see here, from 2012 to 14, 85% of people stopped, 90% of those received citation, and 93 of those were arrested, were black, whereas only 67% of Ferguson's population is black. There could be a lot of reasons why that number's high, not necessarily because of race. I don't think most cops care about your race.
I think maybe a good place to go from here. So we still have not, or Autumn, you still aren't convinced that the GI Bill impacted the future, or impacted the legacy of like the ability for black families to build generational wealth. That's fine, but let's assume that there was some small effect that caused higher rates of poverty among black communities for that reason, then because of also like segregation and Jim Crow and stuff like that. But let's say that because of those historical factors, there are somewhat higher rates of poverty. There were already somewhat high rates of poverty in black communities. So now, can we talk about the connection between poverty and crime? Because Nick, you might know something about this, and if we can demonstrate that there is a connection between poverty and crime, that might give credibility to the argument that systemic racism is real. Because if black families were put in high rates of poverty, that means that it's almost guaranteed that there's going to be high rates of criminality, and then that's going to create this cascade of effects where black people are having like felonies, and it's hard for them to get jobs. So can we talk about the link between poverty and crime?
We can. I do want to say though that I firmly believe intellect and knowledge prevents crime, not wealth. We see crime and even in the wealthy communities. I think that a well-educated person would know better than to commit a crime. They're more aware of their actions than just, joining a gang because they don't have a father. I think the best way to remedy crime in any area is to fix the education system and get people to think for themselves.
I mean, I would say there's a culture of violence where people are brought up in drugs and violence, and if you grow up in those environments, you're far more likely to commit crime. Obviously, there's crime everywhere among every group in society, right? But at least in my experience, I don't think I ever met a criminal who had not been a victim of crime too. And there is a constant cycle of violence in terms of it. Obviously, there's people who get out of it, but it is something that does occur, and it is a real problem. That's one of the rates. Your rates of reincarceration after you've committed a crime on probation are very high. Like our probation system, especially, is a very good example of that, where people get out and then they reoffend. The number of non-reoffenders is very low. So there is a strong link between crime, poverty, and kind of reoffending. It does seem, at least in my experience, to be linked. I linked an article about it too.
Just now?
Where did I put it?
Where'd you link it to?
There's something. Dynamic links between poverty, inequality, crime, and social expenditures. There's a school to prison to poverty pipeline, and it is very prevalent in the country, I would say. Obviously, just my personal experience. I know it's anecdotal, so completely useless, but from the studies I went through and from the actual studying literature at the time when I was working, was that there was a strong link between the two. and people, because if you were poor, you're also less likely to be able to get a good job. You were less likely to get transport to those good jobs. You were less likely.
And all that makes the criminal life look more appealing because it's easier money.
Well, yeah, and if you don't have useful skills, that is just and if you spend a lot of time in the drug world or in the criminal kind of world already, you're more likely to get involved in it, and that is true. So if your area has a lot more crime in it, you're more likely to get involved in criminal activities. Not to say that you are going to be, but it's more likely. It's had gangs, guns, etc.
So, Autumn, are you convinced that there is that connection between developing cultures of criminality and poverty? Like, if a community is impoverished, they're more likely to develop a criminal culture.
Yes.
Okay. So, do you also agree that because of things like the GI Bill, and we can talk about other things that have prevented Black communities from building generational wealth, because of things like the GI Bill, the disparities of the GI Bill, that Black communities were, and Jim Crow and segregation and stuff, the Black communities were not allowed to build up an economic base of the same caliber of white communities. Do you agree with that, Autumn?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. This is good. And I already, that alone constitutes systemic racism to me. You have a whole ethnic group that's enslaved. They're freed, but they're not allowed to buy homes in the nice neighborhoods. They're excluded from the economy to a large degree. I don't really know too much about Jim Crow, but Nick, was Jim Crow? Did Jim Crow laws prevent Black people from doing business in some ways? Or
there was a black side town, there was a white side town. They had all the major jobs, in the government, were run by white people. There was basically a state of constant terror where there was things like lynchings and things to try to keep the Black population from breaking any sort of racial norms, mixing up the races. There was the white area, the Black area, and the white area got a lot of money. The Black area did not normally when it came to government funds, schools, the quality of institutions provided, and frequently, and negotiations over everything was between them economically, between Black person, white person, was always unequal in a Jim Crow South, because there was always a threat of violence which could be used by a white person. So it was always like sharecropping at the end of the Civil War. The predominant economic system of the Jim Crow South was basically Black people worked on farms and gave peasants gave a part of their produce to the white landowner in exchange for and gave for money. Yeah. So and frequently that negotiation, the white person had a gun, or there was situations like that. So it was very unequal. It was a system of systemic oppression. Black people were excluded from all major forms of power in the government, in the political system, in the judicial system. There were coups. There was violent suppressions in basically where you were destroying Republican governments. Any attempts to create to give Black people any sorts of power. There were riots against freedmen after the Civil War. So Jim Crow was a system which Black people were stuck in from around 1877 to around 1964, around then. And it was backed up by lethal force and killing. And that inevitably would not lead to a prosperous Black middle class, which is one of the reasons why Black people fled from the South to the North to get better jobs in the Great Migration, because there was a whole lot of lynching, a much larger increase in lynchings at the end of World War One, because World War vets at the end of the World War One, Black vets were lynched, and they had served their there was a fear that since Black people had served their country, they were going to get home and they were going to start looking for change, and the same thing at the end of World War II. And that led to the kind of white supremacist power structure to activate and tried to prevent that, which is one reason why the Great Migration in the first place happened.
And one way that the sort of white supremacist power structure was activated was, as you mentioned, the disparity in the GI Bill, the fact that black people weren't allowed to.
Yeah, that's just one example. I mean, in the South,
one small example. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a federal program, but in the South, you had the police were run by the police chief was run. The police were racist. They did not allow like the Emmett Till case. Frequently they were in league with KKK members or other people who would then.
You also have Loving v. U.S., where the Loving family was, before they were married in Virginia, or D.C., excuse me, and they lived in Virginia, they would be constantly harassed and they would just jail the mother even though she was pregnant because she was black.
Good Lord.
So
I would recommend watching the movie Loving. It's a very good film.
Well, into any interracial marriage, any attempts to try to mix the races or have a mixed race couple, or if you came from another town, or if you said the wrong thing to the wrong woman or something like that, then that was a possible death sentence in the Jim Crow South. And you were forced to follow these you didn't get to vote. If you tried to vote, you were facing there were tools put in to basically so that black people could not vote, could not get representatives in the government, could not get representatives in Congress, which is one reason why we have the Civil Rights Act today. And if you were there were institutions that were white only, and the black people could not sit at the lunch counter, black people could not do all these different things that white people could do.
So yes, good, thank you. So those all constitute systemic racism at the time, racism baked into the systems, into the power structures, and everything. Fast forward, so we're 1950, we're 72 years later from that. But those legacies still carry forward in the sense that even after the Great Migration, like migrating from the Jim Crow South to the North didn't automatically put these black families into like a lovely, wealthy situation. Like they were largely only able to live in like the poorest neighborhoods of these cities, these inner cities. And then, I can imagine that's where
I guess I get a little more confused, because many people don't talk about this. And I'm a little confused by this a little bit because, for example, in the North, there were well-paying jobs in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Chicago, and people who talk a lot about systemic racism, a lot of black families went up here and made a fair amount of money at these places, like in auto workers. But at the same time, this was right around when deindustrialization began. Somewhere around the late 60s is kind of when deindustrialization began. Some people argued in the 50s, but it really didn't pick up strength till the 70s, the 80s, when the industrial Midwest started to become the Rust Belt. And that's right around when Jim Crow and racism, when the civil rights movement and things got fully desegregated. But I'm a little confused as to how, when black people moved up here to the North, how they did not, how no wealth was created from that. I understand deindustrialization occurred, but they got jobs at Ford Motor Plant. I believe they were still paid less. I'm not sure about that. But that's a really question. I think that's a really interesting question, because after deindustrialization, I completely understand why systemic racism not being included in the professional classes would be really detrimental. But I'm a little confused as to how, if they had access to some of these blue collar jobs in places like Ford, how intergenerational wealth wasn't amassed. I'm sure there's a good answer to this question, but that again leaves a little bit of confusion, which is why
Well, I mean, if racism was still present in those communities, I mean, the one community that comes to mind, just because I'm from the New York area, is New York. Like, if racism is still present in police, in, I don't know, like the business community, like it wouldn't surprise me if black people weren't excluded from the economy and were unfairly harassed by police during that time. So there might be, going to.
I believe that, like that makes sense to me, that they were still being harassed and such. But at least from the economy in terms of the economy, there was a prosperous economy in the North in the 50s and the 60s. The Great Migration did occur. They had access to some of these jobs. So I guess I'm still a little, maybe they face widespread discrimination, and they're just. I don't know about this, but I haven't. People who talk about systemic racism don't really explain why these things don't matter, and I would like to hear a little bit more about that from people who talk about systemic racism and why the intergenerational wealth was not built in any substantive manner. Obviously, there were riots, right? And right after the black people arrived, in the in the 60s, there were race riots, which destroyed a lot of these cities, and they never really got rebuilt in the North. In Milwaukee, in the 1967, there were riots in Newark, all these cities, right? And that happened because of police brutality, because of police, and that destroyed a lot of communities. And then we had the drug epidemic, and maybe that explains all this stuff. But I'm still not sure.
No, that's fair, man. It's an interesting question as to like why, in that one period, like why didn't generational wealth start to accumulate? I mean, again, like my stereotype is, I've heard of like black businesses getting like bombed, like burned out.
Did that occur frequently in New York in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s? I understand the South completely with the Jim Crow. I'm just a little more confused about, even though there was oppression in the North, there was segregation. We were just talking about wealth. You have access to, they at least access to some of the jobs that in the North, obviously.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I'm willing, just for the sake of this conversation, because it would probably take a whole lot of research for us to figure out like what is the cause of that period not being a period of generational wealth. Maybe we could just move. I'm glad you brought it up because it's interesting. I've never really thought about that before. I didn't know that much about the Great Migration.
I would just bring up one other counterfactual, which is the fact that people frequently cite the Nixon's war on drugs and as the start of systemic racism, right? The war on drugs is frequently started as this was a plot to try to get rid of the hippies, to try to get rid of the left, and to brand them all as radicals because they were all smoking marijuana, right? And there was this whole plot but I guess I'm a little confused about the fact that because drug use did start to rise in the late 60s. Some hard drugs did start to show up, and crime did start to rise. So one thing I'm confused about, if you watch videos like the 13th, I think it's called the 13th. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it was called like the 13th or 14th or something like that. Was there an actual reason to start the war on drugs? No one actually goes over. Was there an actual problem? Because people make it as it was a made-up problem to attack black people and hippies, and white people have even confessed that. People who worked in Nixon's administration have said that, and that's been frequently cited. But I wonder was there an actual problem that the public thought was a problem that led to the war on drugs in the first place? Obviously, it was used with the Southern strategy to manipulate voters and such. But was there an actual problem with drugs? And was there an actual popular demand for a war on drugs, which began it? And I haven't seen a lot of research, a lot of people talking about that. So these are, again, sort of counterfactuals. Obviously, counterfactual is an argument, but this is where our current narratives seems like there's some lacking information.
I'm definitely lacking information on both those, like the aftermath of the Great Migration, like why didn't black families start building generational wealth then? I have my beliefs about that, just like, I have my preconceived ideas about how black people were treated even once they moved to the North. But again, like I'm not that educated about the
topic. Well, there were riots in the North when they moved to North. Yeah. I'm happy. There were race riots. There was in Chicago in 1919 when they moved to the North. There were riots. There were people getting killed. There was, again, exclusion from all sorts of economic fields and such. But as I said, access to those better plain blue collar jobs is my main question, where I'm still a little confused. But obviously we can move on.
Yeah, and then on the war on drugs thing, like same thing. Like I'm not that educated about it, but it's my understanding that for a long time there have been conservative voices, especially in like the Bible Belt, like the rural areas that for like religious reasons or for whatever reasons think that drugs should be outlawed and punished
Yeah, so
harshly.
that's again the counterfactual that is
Yeah.
this necessarily a white supremacist thing that the war on drugs is the war on drugs a white supremacist thing, because a lot of the people who are conservative also just don't like drug use.
It's just not like drugs. Yeah, it would
So
be.
It has to do with a lot with ignorance, though. Like, I
Yeah.
take weed for example. People think that like it's a gateway drug. It's not a fucking gateway drug. It's
probably
just
not.
a plant.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
all
I mean,
it is. It's a plant that has psychedelic effects. Enjoy it while it lasts.
But I
there
mean,
is,
that was
yeah,
seen as against. That was seen as a material pleasure, so it was seen as against, not necessarily being
Christianity.
good for religion.
It'd be against
good for
Christianity.
Christian. So again, these are not things that are talked about, but these are things that I think are more reasonable questions that should be asked when we're actually trying to figure out what is the cause of these things. Obviously, people have said a lot of things. You've read tons of stuff on Facebook, tons of documentaries, millions of documentaries have been made on these topics.
Yeah.
But some of these counterfactual questions just aren't brought up in the documentaries.
I think just based on the little that I know, I think it's reductive to look at the war on drugs and say that this is purely a white supremacist plot. I just don't think that doesn't take all the factors into account. I think there were political, like in the American population, there are political factions that didn't want drugs to be legal and wanted them to be punished harshly. So yeah, I think it is reductive. And yeah, I mean, I haven't been to too many seminar, like intersectional seminars or whatever, but like I think you're right. I think that they do paint the war on drugs as purely just
I mean, that doesn't make it
white supremacy waging war against black bodies.
I mean, when we had things like cocaine and we had police being sent to and numerous government programs and a whole campaign against that, and that ended up again with the police going to police black communities, then you can see how that turns into that. But I'm not sure the idea that it the sort of planned plot against black people that's portrayed as, I'm just not sure. It's as I said, it was a question. It's like the Wannsee Conference question in the Holocaust. Was this actually a plot that was going to destroy people?
Sure, and maybe it was. Maybe Nixon and his administration were sitting in their offices, twirling their mustaches, going, "Ha, this is a good way to keep the black population down because we want because we're eugenicists and we want like a majority white population."
I mean, there is an argument that it was used to divide the to take the population of the hippies and the new left and divide them from Renaissance people and the black people. So it would divide those groups from each other, so that would, and people would latch onto it because they were concerned about crime and drugs. So, as I said, again, it's really confusing as to what's the actual cause and what's not. Political conditions aside.
Yeah. Well, we can, those two specific instances, like the aftermath of the Great Migration and the war on drugs, we can put them aside for now. They're very interesting topics. Maybe if we do some independent research, we can reconvene and talk about them. But let's keep going on this causal chain. So we have agreed, the three of us have agreed that things like Jim Crow, segregation, and the GI Bill disparity resulted in some black communities or most black communities being unable to build as much generational wealth at that time compared to white communities. And then we've also agreed, the three of us, that there is a link. There's a link between poverty and crime. If neighborhoods are impoverished, they're more likely to develop like a big criminal element. So now here we are, fast forward 2022, black neighborhoods tend to be either over policed or under policed. There's broken windows policing. You'll get pulled over for nothing, just because of stop and frisk. There you go. Yeah. And then at the same time, if somebody gets shot, you're in a black neighborhood and somebody gets shot and you call the cops, they're slow to respond if they respond at all.
Yeah.
Maybe under policing is it's pretty easy to just look at that and see what it is. These are poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods. Police are less concerned about protecting people than they are about, like, I don't know, just like busting, like trying to like, do the wire thing and just like work their way up the chain to bust the heads of these drug rings or, sex trade rings or whatever. So under policing is pretty easy. Like these neighborhoods aren't policed for this resident safety because the police are understaffed and there's just like they don't want to direct resources to that. Over policing, that is more of an interesting topic. So like a lot of black neighborhoods are over policed. People on the right would say the reason for this is because there's a criminal culture in black neighborhoods. And I like that sounds racist to me when I hear that, but I'm willing to sort of entertain the idea. So is it clear to us that because of this history of poverty, as a result of systemic racism and the resultant criminal culture that develops in impoverished neighborhoods, that the over policing that we see in a lot of black neighborhoods is an example of systemic racism?
I don't know, Autumn. What do you think?
You go first, Nick.
I don't know if I want to answer this question.
All the more reason why you should.
Because it looks at least partially a result of that to me.
I think it's definitely a result of. I mean, this is like a chicken and the egg hypothesis. We have something that builds in systemic inequality, like the GI Bill, and then police are sent to, and that leads to more poverty, and then that leads to the police also being sent in to deal with more impoverished neighborhoods because that's where criminality tends to occur more, and
that's right.
So this is why I don't know if I want to like make some broad conclusion about it because it doesn't. There is racial bias in those communities, and the police there is more the number of homicides, at least in my town, 70%. I believe 70% of the 70 to 80% of the homicides were involved a small neighborhoods, not small group of neighborhoods, which were predominantly black. So the police chief said, yeah, we spend most of our time policing those neighborhoods because that's where most of the violence is. And our job is to stop homicides. Right. So that is what and that is a part of the, I guess, systemic racist structure nature. Is that what creates the culture? Is that what creates the violence? Is that what creates the crime? I mean, I don't know how helpful those questions. I'm not really even sure how helpful those questions are. I mean,
they're not really in terms of in terms of achieving the results that we want. Those questions aren't really helpful. The more helpful questions are, what do these individual communities need to make them safer and more prosperous?
I can tell you exactly what the problems I can say some things that the communities might need that might help them, like around transportation, housing, property values. There's lots of things that those communities might need that would assist them in success. A lot of government policy is built upon trying to get more wealth and tax base for those. And so most governments look at those communities as being as politically not helpful to them because they're not getting a higher tax base. So they build up some condos and high-rise apartments. And this is where maybe systemic racism is. This is a better argument. Is that
gentrification?
What? Gentrification. Yeah, maybe there's some systemic racism there because they're not seeing these communities as valuable and worth building up in some sort of affirmative way, but instead they're building up some condo development to attract some other people from other areas to come move there and provide a tax base. And that is disregarding these communities and trying to help them build up in some way. So I would argue systemic racism may be more built into gentrification than other things. Like that feels like a better argument for systemic racism to me. People can disagree with me on that, but the general fact that you have these communities, black and brown communities, and the state doesn't view them as particularly the government's more interested in building a tax base than maybe building up the communities. And that's an argument. I like that argument. That sounds like a good argument as to how these states function and how that could be a systemically racist practice.
I mean, so like our goal or my goal today is not to talk about like solutions to, I mean, we could at the end maybe talk about solutions to the legacies of systemic racism or solutions to gentrification, but to sort of define the term of systemic racism. And I don't think that framing is helpful for systemic racism because like this is just exploitative capitalism. It is more profitable for these rich people to buy up properties, build them up, build these luxury apartment complexes, charge, in Portland, charge, $1,500 a month for for a 1-bedroom and push out all the people who used to be in that neighborhood. Portland is a majority white city, and the reasons for that also, I mean, Oregon was excluding black people from even living in the state at first. So like,
you've already some racial systemic racism. There you go.
Well, no, but I mean, we can look at any city that's being gentrified. And I don't think that race is the best lens to view gentrification with, because it's more about economics. It's more about how can we wealthy landowners extract the maximum value from this land, rather than thinking about the health of the community and whether low and middle income people will be able to afford rent, or whether they'll be pushed out, as they are being in Portland. So no, I don't think that, like, yeah, it's sort of it like, to use sort of the intersectional language, it sort of like perpetuates the legacy of systemic racism, but I don't view gentrification as systemic racism itself, because it cuts across racial lines.
I'm just throwing out the different intersectional / more legitimate. There's like intersectional arguments that are better, and then there's intersectional arguments that are worse. And that's, at least to me, one of the better ones compared to one of the worst ones. You point out why it's bad, but at least I feel like that and the GI Bill are better arguments than the other arguments, like with the police encounters, because the police encounters are so, like, I don't know if that was caused by racism or not.
Sure.
You know?
Hey man, I mean, if using a racial frame to describe gentrification helps cities push back against gentrification, I'm fine with that. Like, if they need race to be a factor in order to draft legislation that prevents these neighborhoods from
that runs counter to some intersectional theorists who have told me that we need to get rid of the whole racial identification system, and we need to stop having racism on the census box and stuff. Well, if you removed racism from the census box, how would you stop gentrification and uplift communities of certain racial groups if you get rid of the census box for gentrification? So this again is why I don't even know what to say. I don't know what an argument is that makes any sense here. So I'm still a little out to lunch.
You got anything on him?
No, my brain's pretty much dead right now.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's been a lot of talk. So
it's not that I'm still fucking worn out from that trip, and I haven't been able to get any sleep because my fiance doesn't put his CPAP machine on, so I get to hear the bear snore right next to me.
Oh man, sorry to hear that.
No, you're fine. It's actually been almost an hour and 30 minutes.
Okay.
We can call it.
Okay, if you want to call it. I'm not sure what else to cover.
Yeah, I mean, just to briefly respond to the last thing Nick was saying. I mean, like, the ultimate goal should be, I have said this, the ultimate goal should be a society in which race is rendered unimportant and irrelevant, because race itself is an arbitrary concept that doesn't actually describe anything real. Ethnic groups in Africa are all very different from each other, even if they are vaguely dark brown. So like, race is not a helpful lens. So I'm hoping that we get to a future where there doesn't need to be racial boxes checking on the Census Bureau. The only reason that we need them is because there are inequities between these quote unquote racial groups. Like, what isn't one of them Asian / Pacific Islander, which is like the dumbest fucking category you can imagine.
Kind of. I think the reason why is because they came from Asia.
It's dumb. It's a very dumb category. So like, we should be moving towards a society where that's not.
Maybe there weren't enough people who.
I think it's Native American and Pacific Islander.
I think it's Native American and Pacific Islander, because Native Americans and Pacific Islanders are both somewhat viewed, I guess, by the government. Pacific Islanders were viewed as like part of their as an indigenous people, I guess. So that's how
I don't think that's the category. Let me just look at it real quick. Census race categories. I think it's Asian / Pacific. All right, so there's white, African American, Alaska Native, Hispanic. Asian isn't even on here. Wow, that's really.
We don't even care about them.
Oh God.
There's too many of them.
Yeah. Oh no, you're right. You're right. Actually, I was wrong. For some reason I thought it was Asian / Okay. No.
I think they're looking. I think the word they were looking for was indigenous, and they came up with Native American / Pacific Islander. And I think
better than fucking Indian. I hate when people go, "Oh yeah, that person, my friend's Indian." It's like, oh, he's from India.
American Indian, according to this 2021 article on census.gov, American Indian. So it's white, black, American Indian / Alaska Native, Asian, and Native Hawaiian / Pacific Islander.
Oh, okay.
So these are the race categories apparently. Asian, but like that's what I'm talking about. Asian, Indian, Russian, Chinese, like these are totally different fucking
Well,
things.
wait a second. So the idea, these categories are based on how people identify in communities in America. So that's why they were. That's where the census came up with them, because federal.
I think that idea exists in the communities because the government and other entities forced it upon.
Wait. No.
Yeah.
People came here from all different cultures, all different nations, and they formed communities for self-protection and
Yes, but you don't see Indians mixing with Russians and Chinese, and the Chinese with the Japanese.
Yeah, it's like they're not all one category. Very different.
Yeah,
that's
true.
I
think when you put these census listings here like that, people are gonna stop adopting it because they see it. Well, it's official.
Well, do you really think that America is built upon census data? I mean, there seems to be an obsession.
It's not just census data. It's cultural notions that are passed around by word of mouth.
If we just change the census box to American, as everyone checked the box that said American, would that change how people?
That would weed out the illegals. We should do it.
Oh God!
You're gonna get in so much trouble for this podcast.
Yeah. No. So what I was saying was like these are arbitrary categories. Race is arbitrary categories. The only reason to categorize people into race is as a means of gathering data so that we can try to move towards more equity between these quote unquote racial groups, because some of these racial groups have been economically marginalized and culturally marginalized. But no, man, I mean, like,
so you want us to add more census? But shouldn't we add then lots of more census categories for that instead of getting rid of the census? We want getting rid of census categories. We want to add more to get more data for different groups. That will be an argument that we need more census data. We need the government to spend more time looking at different racial groups in America. That's the precise opposite argument that I've even heard from a lot of activists in these movements saying they don't want that. They want the government to do less of that.
Look, I'm not that invested. Like, I haven't actually looked at the activist arguments against census categories. I'm not really invested in the census. I mean, I'm only using the census as like a clumsy example for me to say, like, we should be moving towards a post-racial society where we're not looking at people by their race. We're judging by the content of the character, all that sort of generic argument.
Yeah, obviously, I think in the long run, you want to have a post-racial society, or that's the objective. Everyone's objective, whether or not you're conservative, liberal. I think unless you're a white supremacist or a national or a racial nationalist at some point, everyone wants a post-racial society. I think that is pretty much everyone's view. And some people think we entered in the 60s. Some people think we still are extremely far away from it. So, I mean, I think that the idea of where I think most people would like the census to get rid of all that stuff eventually.
Yeah, I mean, but like now that I'm thinking about it, like I like censuses. Censuses?
Well, there's a lot of stuff in the federal government which people are eligible based on their race. I mean, Native Americans, are counted in the census.
But that's my point. That's just a means of correcting existing racial disparities. Like, if we correct those racial disparities.
No. But they're also legal entities. For example, Native American reservations are legal entities. As long as those exist, the Native American reservations are their own legal entities. States are their own legal entities, and it's not, as long as, there are means for correcting discrimination, but there are also just a means of distributing resources and giving out information so they know how many Native Americans there are for representation purposes. But there are some actual, as I said, reasons for it.
Yeah, sure. Now that I think about it, like, I'm not opposed to the census. I don't mind there being, like, I want us to move away from these like 6 totally arbitrary categories at least, so that we can maybe we should have more categories. Like, are you Central Asian? Are you East Asian? Are you South Asian? Are you are you Eastern European Jewish? Like, things like I think that's a more useful frame to look at. I mean, this is again like a very generic and uninteresting argument. I'm just saying that, like, we should be.
Well, I think there you could ban. I do not know on job applications you could ban the box you check for race on a job application. I believe you can still be asked your race on a job application. I don't know. Yeah. You can't be discriminated against it, but that does show up on job applications, right?
Sure.
and that's not illegal to put on a job application. So things like that could be, on the census, on the job applications, those really shouldn't necessarily be questions because those are, as you said, is a construct. But again, we have laws like affirmative action, diversity, which do require these things. So we are creating our own impetus for it to kind of continue almost, because we have government laws, we have resource allocations based on race,
Well, hopefully, at a certain point, we will not need to have government allocations based on race because the inequities that are built into the system will just be corrected through good policy. That's what I'm hoping for. Anyway.
That's definitely a hope.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
I don't mind ending there. It was a little vague, but we at least got to sort of define the term systemic racism in a way that makes sense to all three of us. We talked about the link between crime and poverty. There may be another podcast episode sort of adjacent to the subject. Like maybe we'll do one on policing and police reform.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Good chat.
All right.
Yeah, good chat.
Well,
thanks for
go
hosting.
Go ahead and end it. No problem.
Cool.
Thank you everyone for watching. Don't forget to like button and hit that subscribe button and hit that bell notification for more information just in case you miss it. Thank you and have a good day.